Rabbi Avremi Zippel of Chabad Lubavitch of Utah, thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you for having me.
You recently revealed that you as a young boy and into your teenage years were severely abused, sexually abused by a nanny in your home. You are the son of a very prominent Jewish leader here in Utah, and you come from a very religious home. How did this happen?
I think that's a question that a lot of people have asked. I think I've asked. I think my parents have asked. I don't know that there's a good answer to that question. I think that what it does is it forces us to perhaps reconsider our perception of these issues, that they only happen in a particular type of household to a particular type of people. And I think that it really enlightens us to two facts, and that is A, how prevalent this issue is, and B, the steps that we need to take to be educated about this as a society and as a world, because it can happen to anybody. And it might happen to anybody. There's a good chance it might happen to anybody. And I don't think any of us are immune to this issue or protected from this issue due to our station in life or the upbringing of our homes or anything like that.
Why are you coming forward now, and how difficult has it been to come forward?
I'm coming forward now. Primarily it began because of the fact that it was becoming, a matter in the courts, and I was going to have to testify. And I kind of felt that I wanted my story to be out there. But it's interesting how these things start due to one reason, and then they really evolve into taking on a life of their own. And so I think what started for me as a deeper reason, but over the past few weeks has really risen to the surface. I wanted to tell my story to help people. I hope, and I feel that there are others out there that might benefit from hearing about it. And it was my hope to help them. And it's been a process. It was initially, I was quite hesitant about coming forward and about sharing this, this journey. I wasn't sure how people were going to react. And the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People have been supportive. And indeed, in a short amount of time, my hope has been realized. I have been able to help people, and people have come forward and wanted to talk about their own abuse as a result of the story. And so that's been a win.
At what point did you realize what was happening to you was actually abuse, and how did that change your heart and your mind in regard to what happened?
So specifically, I was 20 years old when I really, came to terms with the idea that I had been sexually abused. I think it's a term that, as a young man, I never associated with myself. I felt like the term sexual abuse was limited to very specific situations, and the main reason why it did not apply to me was because all of my interactions with my abuser were what I had perceived as consensual, in the sense that I never screamed and I never asked for it to stop, and I never felt coerced. I never felt like anything that was being done was against my will. When I was 20, I was home in bed. I had broken my leg and had knee surgery. And I was watching a Law & Order Special Victims Unit episode, in which the character in the episode is led to understand that as a young man, he had been sexually abused by a female babysitter. And when I watched this initially, I was shocked, really, that could be a reality, that that a young man could go through this with a female babysitter, an older woman, and that would be called sexual abuse. And that really kind of, shook me for a number of years, and it took a number of years for me to deal with it. But it was probably one of the most shocking moments of my life to find out that term, that very loaded term, applied to me.
So here you were as a young boy, and the abuse happened from the time you were 8 years old until you were 18.
That's correct.
During that time, what did you think was happening, and how did you reconcile that with your faith?
I think the question about reconciliation, I didn't. And the short answer is no. The short answer is I didn't reconcile it with my faith, and it was what led me to incredible inner turmoil on a daily basis. My abuser had led me to believe that what was going on between the two of us was her efforts in trying to prepare me to be a good husband and the like. And
And you believed her?
I suppose so. You know, I certainly didn't have good reason not to believe her. I think that deep down I knew that what was going on was inappropriate and it was wrong, and not just on a societal level, but it was certainly something that was against my faith. You know, that was something that I was certain about. And indeed, it led me to this kind of, you know, just world of uncertainty as to, you know, what was I doing, and with the uncertainty of what was I doing, that led to the uncertainty of who was I, and what kind of person does these things really. And I would say, you know, in a certain sense, the secondary abuse that you go through in your own mind, that you subject yourself to as a result of the abuse that you go through, is, you know, just as bad, if not worse, than the actual abuse that you are subject to do at the hands of somebody else.
During the time that you were being abused, you felt terrible guilt, from what I understand. What was worse, feeling that guilt or contemplating what might happen to you if anybody found out what was going on?
Undoubtedly, somebody finding out. I think a lot of people, when they ask, you know, what's this process of coming forward been like? I think a lot of people have the perception that it's, you know, you tell your story and the cat's out of the bag, and, you know, and almost like everyone lives happily ever after that. And I think that the important point to understand here is that for survivors of sexual abuse who carry a secret for so long, the act of like declassifying that information is a lengthy process, which in a certain sense almost takes as long as it took to bury that secret. You know, I think we need to think in the terms that, you know, if you have a secret and you spend the better part of your lifetime burying that secret under layers of secrecy, it takes that amount of time, if not longer, to uncover that, and all those feelings that you heaped on top of that secret in the aim of, you know, burying it as far away as possible, takes a lot of undoing. But to me, that was the only way that I would make it through, is that nobody were to ever find out about it, and I would have gladly taken that guilt, you know, every day and twice on Sunday.
Eventually, you got older, your parents no longer needed a nanny, you went off to rabbinical school, you got married, came back. What has been the effect of what happened to you on your marriage?
Well, before I sought help, and before I acknowledged the abuse in my own life, I think that it had a far more profound effect on my marriage, on my life, on my general well-being than I ever thought it would. You know, I had, I guess, convinced myself of this reality that if I didn't think about it, it didn't exist. And if I banished it to the furthest parts of my mind, there it would stay and never crop up again. And that's not the way it works. You know, I discovered that. Not in my own life, not in the lives of those that I come in contact with. You know, it's not something that you can just push away to the furthest recesses and hope it will stay there. When I came forward with the support of my parents, when I disclosed to my wife and to my parents, I think it rocked their world, as it was rocking my world in the process. The uniqueness of the situation, you know, obviously contributed to that. You know, how much of a non-issue this typically is in the observant community contributed to that. And again, I think it kind of reinforced to them this reality, or it brought to them this reality that there's no such thing as being immune to this issue. No group of people is immune to this issue. No community is immune to this issue. There's nothing you can do that can make you absolutely protected from the evils of sexual abuse. Naturally, we can teach our children and we can give them tools to cope with this, but just because of who we are does not inoculate us from this issue.
I'm certain that you have contemplated this question for decades now. But what is it about sexual abuse that is so violating to the victims? Why is it that sexual abuse, of all kinds of abuse, is so devastating to the human soul?
I think it's a question which, if you ask 10 people, you'll get 10 different answers. I think that every survivor of sexual abuse would have a different answer to that question. But I think what it all boils down to is that I think as a survivor, you feel that it is a violation of the deepest sense of self. I think that when one is, you know, abused and violated sexually, there's a certain innocence that as humans we believe exists inside each and every one of us, that is taken from us in that moment. I think that's true of all survivors of sexual assault, but I think especially when it comes to, the sexual abuse of children. I think as a child, that there are certain things that go on in the world around you that are wrong and inappropriate, but there's a certain breach of this, purest sense of innocence that is taken from you in that moment that you can never get back. And indeed, that was part of my recovery process, was really coming to terms with that reality that you could never get it back, that, you can't rehabilitate yourself into that sense of innocence that you once had. And I think, the stigma that is typically associated with it and the shame that's typically associated with it reinforces that, because you continue living in this world where this part of you, which you hope never to speak of, and now you certainly hope never to speak of, is gone. And that sets you apart from every other human being, because every other human being that walks the planet has that intact. But you are now different, and you're a marked person, different than everybody else in the entire world.
Or so you think.
Or so you think. And then, and indeed, as you experience, your recovery is encountering others who are in that same position, and being able to share that mutual feeling that, we are not broken and we are not bad. We have been violated, sure, and there's a way that we can come back from that. But that does not inherently mark us as bad or as damaged.
How are you recovering from this experience, and where are you in the spectrum of recovery?
I think that the most difficult part for me of recovery from sexual abuse was the realization that, I refer to it somewhat darkly, but it's a terminal illness. In the sense that there's nothing you can do that will make you whole again. There's no amount of medication you can take, or therapy that you can go to, or books that you can read that will fix you. This is your life from this moment forward, for all eternity, for the rest of the life that you will know. This is your reality. I think in the beginning that was, just overwhelming for me in a certain sense, and it was something which I had such a difficult time with. And you learn over time how to cope with that, and how to deal with that, and how to find support from those around you who seek to provide support, and how to find support from others who are in the same boat, and how to, come to a place where you can acknowledge that, and you can own that, and you can use that to motivate further growth in your life. But I think that when we speak of recovery from sexual abuse, I think it's important to understand, and at least it was for me, that reality, that this is you forevermore.
How do you find peace then, now? When you contemplate the things that have happened to you, where do you find peace? Can you find peace?
You absolutely can find peace, and you should find peace. And you find peace in the sense that, each and every one of us has their burden. I find peace by acknowledging those that I'm able to help, by being grateful for those that have come before me, by being grateful for my faith. I think my faith, my believing in a God that loves me and accepts me for who I am, warts and all in a certain sense, has been a tremendous part of my healing. I think that it kind of comes hand in hand with the recognition that, there is no perfect human being who walks the earth, sexual abuse or not. We each have our path. We each have our own path of recovery. We each have our own path of self-improvement, of striving to become a better person than we were the day before. And I think the acknowledgement that that path will never lead to perfection. That is a path that we walk on every day of our lives, and it's a path that never ends. And every day we have the responsibility and the opportunity to continue perfecting ourselves, but we will never become perfect, because that's not our goal. Our goal is to become better, not perfect. And so you walk the path of self-improvement, you seek to make the world better for yourself and for those around you, and you hope to find peace through that. And indeed, I think that's the only way to find peace.
What happened to you is absolutely unthinkable, devastating, and of long duration in your life. When you finally told your wife and your parents, but most especially your wife, what had happened to you, how did she receive that? How has she responded? And how does she help you going forward?
Initially, everyone needs to find their own support system and my wife is blessed to have that in her life, as I am blessed to have her and my parents and those who provide my support system in my life. I think that at first there's the acknowledgement that nobody can truly grasp what you have gone through, especially in our community where it's not very often talked about, and there's so much unknown about it. Everyone needs their time to process and to cope and to try to understand. I find that in speaking with fellow survivors, all we seek to be is understood. And there's kind of a dual-edged sword with that, because on one hand, that's all we want. On the other hand, you find that nobody can really understand you unless they've been through it themselves. And so there's kind of this impossible balance that you seek to strike. But in terms of my wife, she was blessed with a support circle, and she has found faith and healing in what she considers her path now in life and my path in life. And, moving forward, she continues to be a rock of strength and inspiration and fortitude, and in, coping with what this has to do in her own life, and in, being supportive to what I can then do with that in mind.
We are broadcasting to a largely Christian audience. Please help us Christians understand how Judaism deals with guilt and sin. You say you felt a lot of guilt through all of this. You felt like you were the worst of sinners. How does Judaism help you to deal with those feelings?
It's interesting because I find that a lot of people would say that religion is what leads them to feelings of guilt. And I think at the same time, it's religion's responsibility to help us deal with feelings of guilt. I have found that in my own life. I have found that though my faith initially probably had a lot to do with the feelings of guilt and shame that I experienced, it was the strength that I got from my faith that gave me the tools to deal with said guilt and shame. But you mentioned sin. Sin is a reality in Judaism, and I think in every religion. There are things that we are meant not to do that we do. There are things that we are not meant to do and we don't do. That's the nature of things. And we are all imperfect human beings, and sin is a reality in our lives. Guilt typically follows sin. And so the idea is that if I have sinned, I should now feel guilty. And I think the point that we often miss is that it's the subsequent guilt that drags us into greater sin. And so I think that Judaism views sin and guilt as kind of being this endless vicious cycle. Sin leads one to guilt, which leads one to sin, to further guilt, etc.
Right.
And so Judaism's perspective of guilt is that guilt is something which can be used for inspiration, but in very, very narrow circumstances. Jewish mysticism speaks of the difference between depression and bitterness. Depression just leads one to a very, demoralizing sense of self, whereas bitterness is something which spurns one to improve and to learn from one's mistakes. And so, indeed, it's been my faith which led me to tremendous feelings of guilt, to unspeakable feelings of guilt. And it's been my faith which has, reminded me, after I think understanding it from a clinical perspective and from a criminal perspective, that, I need not feel guilty about what had happened to me. I need to use this as a further opportunity to connect to God and to find faith and healing through my connection to God, to further rid myself of guilt moving forward and to end that vicious cycle.
Do you feel like you've been successful in getting rid of the guilt and the feelings of sin after this experience?
I think that is part of the daily experience. I think that when we speak of the regular struggles, the constant struggles that survivors of sexual abuse go through, I think that it's predominantly shame and guilt. It's loneliness. It's really this feeling of tremendous lack of self-worth and feelings of self-loathing. And I think that when we speak of this, this reality of this regular struggle with the experience of being a survivor of sexual abuse, those are the feelings that you will struggle with every day. And so, I don't think that there ever comes a time where you can declare total victory over them. That's part of the process which you learn to accept.
Are you bitter at all about what happened to you and bitter toward the woman that allegedly abused you? And what do you hope happens to her?
That's an interesting question. I was asked recently about the criminal justice procedure, if it's personal. And I think it's not. I feel that I did what I considered was the correct and appropriate action as a private citizen in going to the police and letting the criminal justice system play itself out. As it pertains to that, I leave my faith in the system. I'm sure that however it will resolve itself, it will resolve itself. And I feel that kind of, requiring to feel the control over the duration of the situation is certainly unhealthy. I would say that I question, why me and why this? Mm-hmm. And I think that I find an answer to that question. And the answer to that question is because there's a purpose, because, some good will come out of all of it. I don't know if that particularly satisfies the specifics of the question, why me and why this? Why couldn't some good have come out of the situation some other way? But that's where faith comes in. And I think that's where, this reality that, there is a purpose to all of this. There is a reason for all of this, specifically in the way it went down. Why that is, that's something which I will never know. And I'm comfortable with that being part of my faith. I'm comfortable with there being parts of my life or my faith where I will never understand the extent of God's thinking. But in the grand scheme of things, have people been helped through my journey? 3 weeks into this journey, I'd like to say yes. And so to me, that makes it worth it. And that kind of absolves me of bitterness and lends me some positive outlook on the situation.
Let me ask you specifically then, how has this experience affected your rabbinical duties and how you interact with especially the youth who may be going through this very same thing?
I think that the primary responsibility of a member of the clergy across any faith, and really the responsibility of any adult who is in a position to lead others, is to be a listener. I find that, when people come to talk about a particular issue, they more want to get things off their chest than hear the sage counsel that their ecclesiastical leader has to offer them. They want to talk. They want to be heard. They want to feel listened to. They want to feel like somebody else cares about their problems. In my experience, just over the past few weeks in encountering other survivors of sexual abuse, I have found that that is our language. We're all people who have been through a common experience. Not one of us attempts to portray ourselves as having all the right answers. All we can do is listen to each other and really provide a shoulder to cry on one for the other and share the common experiences that we have without sharing earth-shattering wisdom that one of us has come up with. So I think my experience in dealing with fellow survivors and seeing what can benefit them out of any given situation has really taught me great listening skills that I think apply to anybody. At the end of the day, everyone has that in common. They just want to feel heard. They just want to feel that their problems are important to somebody and somebody can really listen to them and hear them and understand what bothers them without so much the need to be able to share with them great wisdom. And so it's made me a better listener, which I think is a tremendous tool in helping people.
You and your wife have 2 young sons. Has what happened to you made either one of you hypervigilant and hypersensitive to what goes on, either with the babysitter or in the way you raise them?
So it's funny you mentioned that, Bob, because that has been the experience that so many of our close friends and family have gone through. And it's interesting that without coordinating with each other, we both have not reacted that way. So I have a number of friends who have heard the story from me, even before it was out to the general public. And they would call me and they say, listen, I heard your story, and I went home and I talked to my wife and we fired our babysitter. Just all of them. We fired all of them because of your story. I think the people who react to my story in that way, I almost feel like in a certain sense they might be missing the point. And the point is that short of putting your kids in bubble wrap and locking them in the house, you cannot protect them from the world around them and from the different people that exist in the world around them. But here's what you can do. What you can do is you can provide for your children an environment where they are taught and they know that they can talk to you about anything, that nothing is their fault, and that everything which happens in their life, there is a safe place for them to talk about. And so it has not made us hypervigilant in any way. I mean, we have babysitters that are with our kids regularly. Instead, it has reinforced to us the need to create that environment in our home for our own children. Namely, this is a safe place for you to talk about anything, even if there is a topic which you feel guilty about talking about, shameful for talking about. Not in this home. This is somewhere where you can talk about anything.
A safe place.
The epitome, I think, of a safe place.
No doubt there are others who, like you, are suffering through sexual abuse even now as we speak. If you could speak directly to them, based on your experience and what you've been through and where you are on this spectrum of recovery, what would you say to them to encourage them and to maybe instill some courage in them?
I appreciate that question. And I hope there is somebody out there who's watching this, who might find that inspiration. Because I lived in that world for a number of years. I would scour the internet looking for, victims talking about their experience in court and the like. And so the message that I would share with anybody who might be watching this, who would be going through the same thing, I shared this with a fellow survivor a few days ago, and it was kind of shocking almost to say it, but it was something that I feel we really connected on. There were nights when I would go to bed, when I would brush my teeth and look in the mirror, I was convinced that the person looking back at me was loathed by the entire world. If they were to know, the extent of my actions, everybody in the entire world would find me despicable. Horrific, really, if they were to know, and that's why it was important for me to keep it a secret. And so I shared with this person that I was speaking to that, my wish for them was that after our conversation, if tonight they go to bed and they look in the mirror and they engage in that thought process that I know I did so many nights, they should know that it's the entire world that thinks that, with the exception of me. I don't think that about them. I've heard their story, I've heard what they've been through, and I think they're a beautiful and remarkable human being. And perhaps tomorrow night when you go to bed, you'll have spoken to one more person, and you'll be convinced that it's the entire world minus two, and so on. And that number in the minority begins to grow, and you begin to feel less alone in the world, and less that the entire world thinks that you're this pariah. And so if somebody were listening to this, and I could share with them one takeaway message, it is that, take it from me, there's one person in this world that I know, that I can speak for personally, that doesn't think you're a terrible human being, that you don't need to feel lonely and isolated from. You can feel comfortable in my presence. And I wish for you, and I hope that you'll have the opportunity to meet others who will think the same thing, and that will really give you the courage to step forward from the shadows and find a welcoming and embracing and a loving world that accepts you for who you are.
Rabbi Avremi Zippel of Chabad Lubavitch of Utah, thank you so much for sharing your story, for having the courage to come forward.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for being part of Three Questions.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate that.